After 25 years of service, Naomi thought stepping out of the taxi in uniform would feel like coming home. The air smelled of damp leaves. The iron gate still stood where she had once raced her bike as a child, and her heart carried the hope of seeing her parents again. But instead of a welcome, silence pressed against her chest. The intercom buzzed without opening. The house camera blinked coldly, and her sister Claire appeared at the top of the stairs, not with open arms, but with a phone already pressed to her ear. To Claire, Naomi was no longer family, only an intruder, trespassing on memories that had been rewritten. Within minutes, a police cruiser crept down the street, lights flashing, and Naomi realized the truth. The place she once called home had erased her existence. That shock would ignite the battle that followed, where bloodlines collided with the law. Naomi sat in a small cafe the next morning, her uniform still creased from the long flight, her eyes burning from a night spent in the car outside the house that no longer recognized her, when her old college friend Ruth slid a tablet across the table. The world she thought she knew cracked wide open. On the screen was a property listing under a corporate name she had never seen before, Raven Holdings LLC. The house her grandfather had left to her, the one that anchored her childhood, was now registered under strangers. At first, Naomi thought it was some mistake, maybe a clerical error. But Ruth had already pulled the transfer records. Discovery of the forged deed was more than just a line in a file. It was a betrayal sealed in ink. Naomi's name appeared on the seller's line, but the signature wasn't hers. She hadn't signed a single paper connected to that house in decades. Her chest tightened as Ruth flipped to the notarized stamp, signed by a man already under investigation for falsifying legal documents. It was like staring at proof that someone had stolen her identity to erase her claim to the home. The deeper they looked, the uglier it became. Shell company Raven Holdings wasn't a legitimate buyer. It was a buffer, a shield meant to hide the real players behind the transaction. The company had no clear office, only a rented mailbox in another state, and the directors were paper names that didn't lead anywhere. Naomi's stomach turned as Ruth connected the dots. The trail of corporate filings led back to her sister's husband, Brian, a man who had always bragged about his connections in logistics. Suddenly, his late-night deliveries and the unexplained wealth around Claire made a cruel kind of sense. But it didn't stop at the paperwork. Ruth pulled up utility reports on the property, unexplained spikes in power usage, records that suggested refrigeration equipment running full-time, even though no permits for commercial activity had been filed. First evidence of fraud and money laundering began to emerge in the form of spreadsheets and energy logs, the kind of details that ordinary families never think about but prosecutors study closely. Naomi realized they weren't just stealing her house. They were likely using it as part of a larger operation to wash money through shell companies and hidden contracts. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the gravity of what this meant. This wasn't just a family betrayal anymore. It was criminal. Every forged document, every unexplained wire transfer, every shadow company was a thread pulling her deeper into a web of deceit. Ruth leaned forward, her voice calm but urgent, reminding Naomi that people who go this far, people willing to falsify deeds and launder money, rarely stop without being forced. Naomi nodded, a quiet resolve hardening inside her. She had faced combat zones and coded under pressure in foreign tents. She wasn't about to back down now. This fight was no longer just about reclaiming a house. It was about proving the truth, exposing the lies, and holding her own blood to account before the law. Naomi had been trained to notice small details, and that instinct was the only reason she caught the shadow moving near the fence line. Nights spent watching the house that was once hers became a pattern of waiting, recording, and holding her breath, while black vans slipped in and out of the driveway. She crouched low, the microphone of her recorder angled toward a cracked vent. What she heard confirmed every suspicion she carried in her gut. Secret surveillance and audio evidence revealed the truth no paper trail could disguise. Men unloaded boxes, their movements quick and disciplined, while her brother-in-law Brian gave orders like he had rehearsed them 100 times. Then, amid the muffled voices, came a sound that froze her in place. the gravelly tone of her father. His words were deliberate. If she discovered too much, cut the tie. Hearing his voice linked to those plans was like being erased a second time. She stumbled back from the fence, clutching the recorder as if it might burn her fingers. Father's involvement exposed was the one scenario she had prayed wasn't true. Betrayal from a sister was cruel, but betrayal from a father carried a weight that felt heavier than combat armor. Naomi replayed the audio again and again in the silence of her car, her pulse hammering with disbelief and fury. It wasn't just Claire and Brian running a fraud scheme. It was her father standing beside them, signing off on deals, and even discussing how to silence her if she got too close. The man who once walked her to school was now the man plotting to erase her from existence in a far more permanent way. The following days blurred into a tense routine of monitoring and defending. Naomi returned to her temporary rental to find her email accessed without authorization. Files were missing, her inbox flagged with logins from unfamiliar IP addresses. It was a classic smear tactic, undermine her credibility before she could present her evidence. Threats, hacking, and intimidation became part of her daily reality. A slip of paper under her windshield wiper warned her to stop digging. An anonymous text promised her military psych report would be leaked to discredit her. Even her own memories were turned against her. Claire whispered to neighbors that Naomi was unstable, a veteran broken by years overseas. The intimidation was coordinated, precise, almost corporate in its execution. Yet Naomi refused to back down. Each threat only fueled her resolve. She doubled her surveillance efforts, storing multiple backups of every file, looping in allies she trusted from her years in cyber command. The woman they branded as fragile was the same woman capable of building a case strong enough to survive federal scrutiny. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. Every time she drove down the block, she noticed unfamiliar cars parked too long. Every time she logged into her system, another attempt at infiltration appeared. It wasn't paranoia, it was the reality of challenging people who had built an empire on lies and were prepared to defend it with everything they had. By now, the conflict had shifted far beyond a family feud. Naomi was standing against a network of fraud, forged documents, and laundered money tied to people who had no intention of being exposed. She realized her greatest battle wouldn't be convincing the law, but surviving long enough to bring the truth into the light. And for a soldier who had already faced war, this betrayal at home was becoming the most dangerous mission of her life. The morning Naomi walked into Fairfax Town Hall with Ruth, the air carried the same weight she once felt before a deployment briefing. Tense, inevitable, and irreversible. This time there were no weapons or orders, only folders filled with evidence that could dismantle the entire facade her family had built. Injunction and property freeze became more than legal terms. They were her line in the sand. Ruth set the documents on the counter with the precision of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. Inside were side-by-side comparisons of Naomi's genuine signature and the forgery that had transferred her home into Raven Holdings. There were bank records tracing shell companies to Claire's private account, utility reports showing suspicious usage, and notarizations signed by individuals already discredited. The clerk's eyes widened as she read through the packet, realizing this was not just a family quarrel, but a case laced with criminal implications. By noon, the land office had stamped an official hold on all property transfers connected to the house, freezing any further attempts to launder it into shadow ownership. For the first time, Naomi felt a small measure of ground return beneath her feet. Delivering that legal blow meant facing her sister directly. Ruth insisted on serving the papers in person. They drove up the familiar driveway, this time not as trespassers lurking in shadows, but as rightful challengers carrying the authority of the court. Naomi's pulse hammered as she rang the bell. Claire opened the door with her polished smile, one perfected for non-profit fundraisers and holiday cards. The expression drained the instant she saw Naomi standing beside Ruth. Serving legal papers to Claire and Brian was no simple handoff. It was a confrontation years in the making. Ruth's voice was steady as she extended the envelope, declaring the injunction effective immediately and suspending all leases, transfers, or modifications. Claire's hands trembled as she accepted it, her words spilling in disbelief. What is this? Some kind of joke? Behind her, Brian appeared, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp with calculation. His threat was quiet but unmistakable. You really want to go this route, Naomi? You don't know who you're fighting. Naomi met his gaze, her voice calm. She reminded him she had once worked internal investigations at the Pentagon. She knew men who bluffed, threatened, and then folded. For just a moment, she saw it, fear flickering in his expression. It wasn't fear of her, but of the paper in Ruth's hand, the evidence that could strip away the empire he had constructed on deceit. Claire sputtered, her tone laced with panic. You can't do this. You're not even the rightful owner. Ruth cut her off, stating plainly, that's what we intend to prove in court. The door slammed behind them as Naomi and Ruth walked away, but the sound was less victory than confirmation that the cracks had begun. The news of the injunction rippled quickly. Family members who once dismissed Naomi as a ghost from the past now whispered in corners, realizing the fight was no longer private. Neighbors noticed police cars idling longer near the house. Reporters began circling with questions, and Claire's carefully maintained image as a community leader faltered. First signs of family collapse showed in the smallest details. Claire's voice cracking during phone calls, Brian's late-night meetings becoming more frantic, and their father's silence growing heavier as he avoided public appearances. Financial accounts that once flowed freely were suddenly frozen. Credit lines blocked, and whispers of federal inquiry reached even their closest allies. For Naomi, the shift was profound. She had stepped into the role of plaintiff and whistleblower, and with that step, she stripped her family of control over the narrative. They could no longer dismiss her as unstable or irrelevant. The court had recognized her evidence as credible and serious. What began as a daughter knocking on her parents' door had evolved into a legal storm, carrying the weight of federal scrutiny. And though she knew this was only the beginning of a much longer fight, Naomi also knew something her family did not. Once the truth had a foothold in the system, it was almost impossible to bury again. The collapse had begun, and no threat, no smear, and no slam door could undo the fact that the law was now watching. The courtroom carried a stillness Naomi hadn't felt since the seconds before a mission launched. The fluorescent lights hummed. The air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, and every eye in the room turned toward her as she raised her right hand and swore the oath. She wasn't just a daughter betrayed. She was now a plaintiff, a federal witness, and a decorated officer with the weight of proof on her side. Testifying as a federal witness meant exposing not only the lies of her sister and brother-in-law, but also confronting the man who had once been her father. Naomi straightened her posture, her uniform ribbons catching the light, and began to tell her story in measured, deliberate words. She explained how her name had been erased from the deed, how documents had been forged to make it appear she sold her inheritance, and how her identity as a veteran had been exploited to secure illegal contracts. The prosecutor guided her through each step, his tone steady, allowing the truth to unfold without embellishment. Naomi spoke of nights spent in her car, of neighbors whispering that she was unstable, of discovering the shell company that funneled her family's wealth into offshore accounts. She didn't falter, even when her father sat stone-faced just a few feet away. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, but it was also the silence of people listening, of truths cutting through years of lies. Then came the hard evidence. Presenting forensic and digital evidence was not a theatrical reveal, but a steady stream of irrefutable proof. Side-by-side comparisons of Naomi's real signature against the forged one appeared on screens. Financial records showed large deposits into Claire's personal accounts that no nonprofit salary could justify. Metadata tracked suspicious logins back to Claire's home IP, dismantling the defense's claims that Naomi had fabricated her story. Audio recordings were played aloud, her father's voice instructing Brian to cut the tie if Naomi dug too deep. The jury leaned in, pens scratching across notepads, and even the judge's expression tightened. These weren't the vague accusations of a disinherited child. These were facts grounded in forensic analysis, timestamps, and federal chain of custody protocols. The defense tried to resist. Cross-examination and collapse of defense began with Brian's attorney objecting to the admissibility of the surveillance footage, arguing it was obtained improperly. Ruth countered with a declaration from a digital expert, verifying the chain of evidence. Claire's lawyer attempted to paint the conflict as a misunderstanding within the family, suggesting Naomi had voluntarily relinquished her rights years ago. Naomi leaned into the microphone and spoke with calm conviction. A misunderstanding doesn't involve forged deeds, stolen credentials, and the misuse of federal systems for personal gain. The words cut through the defense like steel. Brian shifted in his seat, tugging at his tie, whispering frantically to his lawyer. Claire sat pale, mascara streaking at the edges, her performative calm unraveling. Even their father, who had remained impassive for most of the trial, could not answer when asked to explain the $320,000 transfer traced to his accounts. The weight of silence after that question was more damning than any spoken word. By the end of Naomi's testimony, the courtroom had transformed. What started as a bitter inheritance dispute now stood revealed as a deliberate conspiracy involving forgery, fraud, and federal contract manipulation. Reporters scribbled furiously, veterans in the back row nodded in quiet solidarity, and the defendant's empire of denial crumbled piece by piece. Naomi stepped down from the witness stand, not as the daughter who once begged to be recognized, but as the woman who had forced truth into the open. In that moment, she realized the trial wasn't about reclaiming four walls of a house. It was about dismantling the fortress of lies her family had built, brick by fraudulent brick. And now, under oath and in full view of the law, their collapse had truly begun. The courtroom was quieter than Naomi expected for a moment of such magnitude. No dramatic outbursts, no applause. Just the steady voice of the judge reading each name and each sentence. Sentencing and prison terms unfolded with a finality that carried more weight than any battlefield order Naomi had ever received. Claire was handed 6 years in federal custody, her carefully polished reputation crumbling in seconds. Brian received 8 years, his confident swagger gone, replaced by the tight jaw of a man who had built his life on deals now exposed as fraud. And then came her father, 10 years without parole. Naomi heard the sharp intake of breath ripple through the benches behind her, but she remained still. It was not triumph she felt, but the unmistakable gravity of justice served. Beyond the sentences, the court's order carried financial devastation. Frozen assets and collapse of family empire was the phrase the prosecutor used. But Naomi understood the reality better than anyone. Every account, every property, every investment tied to Claire, Brian, and her father was placed under investigative seal. The cars, the vacation homes, the stocks they had boasted about, all of it evaporated in minutes. What they had built on her silence collapsed brick by brick, leaving behind only the exposed foundation of deceit. For years, they had flaunted their prosperity while dismissing her as unstable, irrelevant, unworthy. Now the law itself declared that their wealth was nothing more than stolen paper and forged ink. Watching their empire dissolve was not satisfying in the way revenge fantasies often promise. It was sobering, like seeing rot uncovered beneath a polished floor. When Naomi stepped out of the courthouse, flashes from reporters' cameras lit up the sidewalk. Veterans in faded uniforms stood near the gates, some leaning on canes, others with ribbons pinned to worn jackets. One extended his hand, calling her Colonel Hale, his voice steady with respect. She shook it, not as a victor, but as someone who understood the cost of integrity. Her story had reached beyond family drama. It had become a symbol of accountability. Completion, not celebration, defined her feelings as she walked down the courthouse steps. She didn't smile. She didn't wave to the cameras. Instead, she felt the quiet sense of something finally finished. A chapter sealed, not with joy, but with clarity. Later, as she stood in front of the Defense Service Library, Naomi read her own name etched in granite alongside others who had given decades of service. It was the only recognition she truly needed. Her family had tried to erase her from history, but here was proof that she belonged to something larger and indelible. She realized she wasn't carrying hate anymore. What remained was clarity, the knowledge that lies cannot stand forever, and that justice, even when delayed, can still arrive with precision. Naomi's fight was never about reclaiming just a house. It was about reclaiming her voice, her identity, and her honor. The verdict didn't bring celebration, it brought closure. And for a soldier who had endured war zones abroad and betrayal at home, closure was its own kind of victory, quiet, steady, and unshakable. Naomi walked out of the courthouse into the sharp light of the afternoon, the sound of reporters shouting her name fading behind the steady voices of veterans who had come to stand with her. Men and women in worn uniforms, some leaning on canes, others with medals pinned to their jackets, reached out in quiet solidarity. Their presence reminded her that she was not defined by betrayal, but by the service and sacrifice she had given without hesitation. Support from veterans and chosen family meant more than any legal victory. It meant she still belonged. She no longer carried the weight of proving herself to those who had erased her. Restoration of name and honor came not from her father or sister, but from the undeniable truth etched into records, verdicts, and the stone walls of history. When she stood in front of the Defense Service Library and saw her name engraved there, she felt no anger, no revenge, only clarity. Justice etched in stone was a reminder that some legacies cannot be stolen, no matter how many lies are written. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more true stories of resilience. And join us as we uncover how justice, in its quiet power, can change everything.